discovered that the authentic life of Billy the Kid was a dime novel. It was a penny dreadful. It was, at best, you could call it a piece of historic fiction. Very little of it is particularly accurate. And so I started reading more about Billy the Kid, and the more I read, and the more I got fascinated. And then a friend of mine challenged me to write about it, and I thought, I'm not sure that's a good idea. One writer in the family is more than enough. And in fact, one writer in the family is too much. Almost any family would agree to. But I said, well, I'll give it a try. And I started writing, and I just had a ball, and I just kept going. I didn't know when I started that it was going to go very far, but eventually it began to turn into something that I was really pleased with.
Well, and kudos to you, because how brave do you have to be Cormac McCarthy's brother to decide to write a novel after you've retired from these other careers? I mean, that's pretty awesome. So I'm excited to hear a little bit more. Do you have a passage you'd like to read to us to introduce us to the scene or to Billy? What have you got?
I'll be happy to. My book, I'll read from the book. And some of you folks probably don't know much at all about Billy the Kid. Some of you probably have read a fair amount about him. But those of you who know nothing about him, let me just give you a very, very brief introduction. Billy the Kid came on the scene when he was an 18-year-old kid, working for an English rancher named John Tunstall. And the range war was brewing at that time, and John Tunstall was on one side of the range war, and Lawrence Murphy and Jimmy Dolan were on the other side. And Dolan and Murphy actually had Tunstall killed, and Billy witnessed the killing, and he was horrified. And basically it changed his life. He was just a gentle kid at the time. He happened to be very good with a gun. He was working as basically as a cowhand. But he vowed revenge. And in the course of that revenge, a lot of things happened that ultimately culminated in a 6-day shootout called the Big Killing, in which the Murphy Dolan side beat the Tunstall side. And so Billy went on the run after that, still vowing revenge. And ultimately, 3 years later, 2.5 years later, he ran into Pat Garrett at Fort Sumner, and Pat Garrett ostensibly shot and killed him. What I discovered through all of this is that we really think we know a fair amount about Billy the Kid. What we know about is the Lincoln County War. The Lincoln County War is how Billy became famous. But we know almost nothing about Billy the Kid himself. We don't know his name, for example. We don't know where he was born. We don't know when he was born. We're not sure when he died. We don't know where he was buried. In the stories that Pat Garrett told about the Lincoln County War, we know a fair amount about the Lincoln County War, but the most famous events that involved Billy the Kid himself, we don't really know what happened. All we know is what Pat Garrett said happened. Well, Pat Garrett actually didn't write The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. Ash Upson wrote it, and he wrote it in about 6 weeks. And he invented stuff. And he wasn't there for these events, and he just said, this is what happened. Well, different people who were there said different things about what happened. So all of the iconic events about Billy, for example, when he broke out of jail and killed the 2 guards and escaped, which is the point at which he no longer was just an outlaw, but he was a world famous outlaw at that point. We don't really know what happened. We don't know what happened at Fort Sumner when he was ostensibly killed. So the facts of the matter are that we know very, very little about Billy the Kid, which is a wonderful opportunity to write a novel. And so I started writing this novel, and as it turns out, there was a fellow and in a very convoluted story who turned up in 1949 named Bill Roberts, and an attorney in El Paso, William Morrison, had was trying to settle an estate. And in the process of settling the estate, he ran into a person who was in the Lincoln County War, and they got talking about it because William Morrison had kin who were involved in all of that. And so they got talking about it, and the guy he was talking to turned out to be one of the main players in the Lincoln County War. His name was Jesse Evans. And so Morrison was talking to him and was talking about Billy being killed at Fort Sumner. And Jesse Evans said, Billy the Kid wasn't killed at Fort Sumner. Billy the Kid is still alive, and he lives in Texas. Well, this was an astounding piece of information. And so Morrison started to work on that, and he went and looked this guy up. And of course, the guy said, no, I'm not Billy the Kid. And it was a funny thing. He said, I'm not Billy the Kid, I'm Billy the Kid's brother-in-law, and Billy the Kid lives in Mexico, which was just, it was a rabbit hole. Well, Morrison continued talking to him, and he realized this guy knew an enormous amount about the Lincoln County War and about Billy the Kid. So in the process of all this, and I won't get into the details because it's a wonderful story, and we would be here, half the night talking about it. But Morrison took Bill Roberts on a tour of Lincoln County and the places that happened in the Lincoln County War, and he recorded Roberts' discussion of all those things. And Robert told wonderful stories about all of those events. And a lot of the stories that he told were not the stories that we had traditionally knew about from Pat Garrett's version. And in fact, Roberts told things that nobody had ever heard about, because people have been looking at Billy the Kid ever since Pat Garrett wrote the book. They've been studying him, trying to find out information about him. And Bill Roberts told things that nobody had ever heard of that they discovered, 20, 30, 40 years later, because this was back in 1948 when Morrison was talking to him. And it also turned out that Bill Roberts was the same size as Billy the Kid. He had 25 knife and gunshot wounds in his body, which Morrison inspected. Photographs of him have been run against the one official tintype of Billy the Kid, and there's a 93% positive rating of it, that the 93% chance that it really is Billy the Kid. So anyway, this guy came along. Now, he really put a bee in the historians' bonnets because they've been writing about Billy the Kid, and they didn't want this newcomer to come in. So over the years, there's been a lot of controversy. A lot of people have dismissed Bill Roberts for various reasons. But he is a potential person, and he died in 1950. He is potentially Billy the Kid. Anyway, my book is the Bill Roberts story. And so the first part of the book follows along the traditional events of the Lincoln County War. And I've taken great liberties because I knew Pat Garrett took great liberties, and there's so many different versions of all these things. So I've invented my own story about the Lincoln County War. And then after the Lincoln County War, I took Bill Roberts and did other things with him and took him through the rest of the book up until 1914. And in 1914, this is when this particular novel begins. And it begins in a bar in El Paso. And he is having a conversation with a guy who knew Billy the Kid. So I'm sorry, didn't know Billy the Kid. Well, actually, he did know Billy the Kid, but he knew the brother of Billy the Kid. And my story is involved with, it's actually an autobiography in which he is telling this guy about his experiences in the Lincoln County War and his experiences meeting this fellow's brother years later and what happened afterward. So that
Okay.
kind of gives you a setup. And so what I'm going to read now, I'm going to start out and read you the prologue, because it sort of sets up the tone of the book.
Okay.
Now,
Sounds great.
and the prologue it's a full chapter, and for every chapter I have an epigraph, and the epigraph in this one is from James Emmett Macaulay, and it's from A Stove-Up Cowboy's Story. Cowboys are good-hearted and kind, sympathetic and not looking for trouble. If it can be avoided, but nevertheless, where nothing but trouble will do, you have struck the right party when you strike the average cowboy. Okay, so now we get into the text. You don't remember me, do you? The San Carlos Reservation? We both had more hair back then. You were scouting for the Army. I'd quit a job at Fort Grant and was headed to the White Mountains. We went hunting together along the Gila, and you shot the biggest mule deer I've ever seen. We were hauling it back to San Carlos when we ran into Geronimo. He'd run off the reservation with a bunch of his boys. I was glad you spoke Apache. I've thought a lot about you since, mostly because of your brother Carlos. He saved my life. Wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here. I'd be buried back at some Mexican whorehouse, my throat cut, or gut shot stealing cattle, or bushwhacked on the Spanish Trail and carried off by coyotes. I've known scores of fine men over the years, but none like Carlos. He was extraordinary. Most likely you don't remember him much. You were pretty young when he left home. I'm glad I finally ran into you again. Wasn't sure I ever would. I found your brother's diary after he died, and I've been carrying it around ever since. It's unusual for a diary. He talks more about what he thought than what he did. I've read it probably a dozen times. Believe he'd want you to have it. Like to tell you about your brother, what I knew anyway. Don't know where to begin except at the beginning before I met Carlos. It'll help you understand why he means so much to me. It started with the Lincoln County War. Might take most of the afternoon. If you're up to it, whiskey's on me. Hear tell I was famous, but I don't know that old boy. He's a product of Pat Garrett's imagination. Him and Ash Upson. They say I killed 21 men. Not if they're talking about hombres I knew. It was 5. I've shot at others, but don't know if I hit any. If you want to include Comanches and Spaniards during wartime, I may have killed 21. I'm a fair shot, and hombres fell when I pulled the trigger, but I wasn't the only fool shooting. Ain't no claiming credit for killing in wartime anyway. I ain't proud of killing the ones I knew. At the time, I told myself they deserved it, or they didn't give me no choice. I've learned to live with most of it. The first one, though, was my own doing, Joe Grant. I was a banty rooster, and he tried to clip my spurs. We were in Bob Hargrove's saloon in Fort Sumner. We'd been drinking, Joe more than me. He'd met me a double eagle. He'd kill a man before I did. I already had a reputation. Folks had heard stories, like one about me killing a blacksmith in Fort Grant. Wasn't true, but I never denied it. I knew what Joe was thinking, considered ignoring him, but Joe was a bad drunk. I should have walked away, would have today. I was working on the Chisholm Ranch on the Pecos. Me and 2 of Chisholm's Jingle Bob hands were at the bar when Joe challenged me to the bet. Then he lifted an ivory-handled 6-shooter from the holster of one of the hands and replaced it with his own Colt with wooden grips. The cowboy was savvy enough to let it slide, but I was a sucker for the challenge. I reached over and lifted the 6-shooter from Joe's holster. Nice pistol you got there, Joe, I said as I twirled it on my finger. Bit fancy, though, even for you. I spun the cylinder and handed it back. He slapped it in his holster. I turned and walked away. What Joe didn't know was the cowboy had fired twice at a jackrabbit coming into Fort Sumner. He hadn't reloaded. When I spun the cylinder, I made sure the next shot would land on an empty case. Fancy pissant, ain't you? Joe said to my back. When I heard the hammer snap, I spun around and ripped 3 shots into Joe's tin. He fell backwards, dropping the 6-shooter. I picked it up and handed it to its owner. Joe was right. I was a pissant. I baited him into drawing. Never done that before or since. It still bothers me. Not the 3 shots, though. You could have covered them with the double eagle I never collected. I was an outlaw. I was not a bandito. No more than the most men. It was hard not to be an outlaw back in them days. You know how it was. Wasn't much alternative. No real law. The government, sheriffs, politicians, all of them crooks. The rest of us were shoestringers trying to get back what the bigwigs stole from us. It says somewhere we hang the small thieves and appoint the big ones to office. Sounds about right. My boss, John Tunstall, wasn't no outlaw. His lawyer, Mac McSween, might have been, but I doubt it. The Lincoln County War started when Mac didn't divvy up a dead man's insurance money the way some folks thought he should. They say Mac stole the money. I don't know. He seemed too God-fearing for a thief. Lots of God-fearing men are thieves, but Mac's religion was real. I doubt anyone but Mac knows for sure. Maybe not even him. His wife Sue might have known. She once said that her and Mac left Kansas headed out here. Mac owed some hombre $300 that he never paid. So here's the gospel story. Gospel as I know it anyway. Memory is a funny thing. It'll fool you. One of my early memories was seeing my pa coming home to Buffalo Gap with Quantrell after a raid in Kansas. I can see the 2 of them now coming through the high grass as clear as I'm standing there. Pap rode with Quantrell all right, but he never brought him to Buffalo Gap. That don't change my memory none. Buffalo Gap's where I come from. It's in Taylor County now. It was just Texas back then. The things I'm going to tell you happened 30, 35 years ago. I ain't sure about dates. To most folks back then, especially farmers and ranchers, seasons were important. Today, tomorrow, and next week were important, but only for a few days. Folks didn't pay much mind to dates. Lots of folks didn't know how old they were. I ain't sure myself. My story begins on February 18th, 1878. You're probably wondering how I remember that date. It's one I don't aim to forget. It's the day John Tunstall died.
All right, very good. Thank you so much for that opening there to the novel, The Gospel of Billy the Kid. What is it about Lincoln County that people are just so fascinated and so drawn into decade after decade?
Well, for part of the reason is that it's still there. It's not changed all that much from 1878.
True.
It's a beautiful little community. It is out of the way. It was the capital of Lincoln County. It was the county seat of Lincoln County, rather. And Lincoln County, as it turned out, was the largest county in the United States at the time. It's about 4 counties now. It got cut up afterward. But it's beautiful country around there, and it has wonderful history. Of course, the Billy the Kid history is marvelous, but there's a lot of other history with it. There's a Mescalero reservation nearby. The original old Fort Stanton is there, and there are lots of sites to see. And if you want to go there to visit, there aren't places to stay in Lincoln County. You can stay at the Inn of the Mountain Gods on the Mescalero Reservation, but it's just a beautiful area, and it's wild, and it's still unpopulated. I don't know what the population of Lincoln now is, but it's very, very small, and it's still just a little, it's just a little road running through town, and it's beautiful.
It is. I actually visited Lincoln County for the first time over the summer during the pandemic. And while many of the museums and sort of historic places were closed to go indoors, you can still definitely walk around there, and just really fascinating stuff about how the town was founded. There was a doctor there who was treating patients with tuberculosis. You can go see these little huts where they sort of quarantine people that were sick. It's just a beautiful area too, right outside of Ruidoso. So definitely try to check that out if you can. I'm wondering about the language, the vernacular, the dialogue, and the character's speech. How did you make that so authentic? How'd you handle that?
Well, I'm from East Tennessee. And East Tennessee, I grew up in, which is right at the edge of, well, it is part of Appalachia, I guess. I grew up on Brown Mountain. I grew up in a rough neighborhood. Um, all my neighbors had been there for generations. The people who came down there came down through Pennsylvania. They came over originally. They were mostly Scotch Irish. There's still a lot of Shakespeare in the language. A lot of words. Like ain't, for example. That's the one word you would pick up in what I've just read you now. But there's a lot of Shakespeare actually in the language in the book, because that language carried around and it didn't leave, because people lived in an isolated area in the mountains in East Tennessee, and they didn't mix much with others. And a lot of those folks moved to Texas. They came with the Alamo and they moved into Texas at other times. And a lot of them wound up in the West. A lot of the characters came, particularly after the Civil War. They were poor dirt farmers. They lost everything. People from the South mostly. They lost everything in the war. They didn't have, the only skills they had really left at that point were they were gotten good with guns. And they came out to the Wild West, and New Mexico was as wild as any place. And a good chunk of the people who lived in Lincoln County, apart from the Mexican families, were Irish, and they had come out of that Scotch-Irish tradition. Like I mentioned early on, the Murphy-Dolan faction was one side of the Range War. Well, those folks were just as Irish as you can be. Billy was Irish, most likely he was Irish. And he came through that kind of a culture, and he spoke that way. So it actually wasn't very hard for me to write like that at all.
Right. Perhaps they got some of that fighting spirit from their Scotch Irish ancestors. I'm
They were all Celtic warriors.
Scotch Irish myself, so known for that fiery temper. I
Yeah.
love the line, hang the small thieves, and then something like put the big ones in office. How did that go again?
Yeah, you hang the small thieves and you point the big ones to office. Yeah, that's basically the line.
I love that line. So good. All right. Do you want to read us another passage before
Sure.
we hop into some questions from the audience?
I will. Now, I mentioned that my story is brushing as Bill Roberts' story.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Bill Roberts is telling this story in 1914, well after the Lincoln County War, well after the episode at Fort Sumner. So I'm not revealing anything by telling you that Billy the Kid survived the fight, the shootout at Fort Sumner, and he had adventures afterward. And so these adventures, they're made up adventures. This is a work of fiction, and I don't want to reveal too much about where the story goes because it takes some interesting twists and turns. But I did take this next chapter is from the middle of the book, and I will tell you, for whatever reasons, Billy, when he's headed west, he's headed to California to get out of New Mexico after Fort Sumner.
Okay.
Because Pat Garrett knows who he's killed, and he knows who he didn't kill, and it's not a good thing for Billy to stay around and be recognized. So he heads to California. And along the way, he gets well, I'll just tell you, he gets bitten by a bat. And in the process, after a few weeks, he develops hydrophobia, which we would call today rabies. And I have to tell you that much because he winds up, he gets found by some Jicarilla Apaches. Well, he's on the Santa Fe Trail. I'm sorry, but he's on the Spanish Trail. He gets found by them, and he's delirious, and he's basically gone. And they take him to a nearby monastery on the Chama River. And he wakes up in the monastery, and there are a handful of monks who are living there. And one of them is named Brother Charles, and one of them is named Brother Bede. And this is a chapter about Brother Bede. And I won't tell you any more about it than that because I don't want to take the story in a weird place for you. But
Okay, so we've got Brother Bede, a monk at the monastery where Billy the Kid has been bitten by a bat and has rabies.
He's got rabies now. You know, the reality is in American culture, people don't survive rabies. Every once in a while, they do. But in this story, he's been found by the Jicarilla Apaches, who, you know, the Navajos call themselves the Dine. The Jicarillas call themselves the Tinde. And when he was picked up, they brought basically a Tinde shaman to treat Billy. And the shaman is called a DN. Okay. That's not his name. His name is Juan Mundo, but his name, his job is as a shaman. He wouldn't say he's a shaman. They would say he's a DN. So this is chapter 16, chapter called Brother Bede. And the epigraph says, there's always risk in being alive. The greater the risk, the more alive you are. And it's a quote from Brother Charles's diary, December 23rd, 1880. And he's put this in the diary pretty close to the time in which this scene actually takes place. All right, now when I'm reading this, there's going to be a lot of dialogue. And so there'll be three characters in it. There'll be Billy, there'll be Brother Charles, and there'll be Brother Bede. And when you're reading it on a page, it doesn't say Brother Charles said, Billy said, Brother Bede said, et cetera, et cetera. But when I'm reading it to you, you won't know who's talking and what's happening unless I insert that. So I'm going to insert some of that into the language as I read, just to try to keep you from getting lost in the conversation. Ever worry about rattlers? I asked. Brother Charles and me were taking our daily walk after breakfast. Brother Charles was wearing sandals. It had been freezing during the night, but the sun was out and the air was beginning to warm. Not at this hour, he said. A few are still around. Most of the locals have left for a den down the river ways. I've heard of snake dens, never seen one, I said. It's an impressive sight, Brother Charles said. Hundreds of them come from all over. They lay out in the sun before holding up for the winter. Would you like to see it? I would, I said. Brother Bede's asked about it, Brother Charles said. I'll check with him. See if we can go this afternoon. Maybe we can catch them before they go underground. We were hiking a trail leading out of the canyon. Monhel is Billy's dog, who plays an important role in the book, and Scout is a dog at the monastery. Monhel and Scout were with us. We stopped to catch our breaths. I tickled Monhel behind the ears. His tongue was hanging out. Suppose you got snake bit, I said. What would you do? No horses. You couldn't ride for help. Brother Bede had pumped me up with whiskey, Brother Charles said. Then he'd suck out the poison and inject the bite with ammonia. But I'd put more trust in Juan Mundo. Now remember, Juan Mundo is the DN who saved Billy's life. He's the DN, okay, here it says, he's the DN who treated your hydrophobia. When Brother Thomas was bit, Juan treated him with herbs and wrapped his ankle in a tobacco poultice. The Tinde have remedies that go back centuries. Sometimes they work. Brother Thomas was lucky. But if a rattler hasn't eaten for a month and he gets a taste of you, you'd better have a strong constitution and the grace of God. Monhel got bit back in the summer, I said. He was sick a few days. You think he had God's grace? Maybe, Brother Charles answered. I don't think dogs are as sensitive to snake bite as we are. My father hunted coyotes and wolves, sold the hides. Almost every hide I ever saw, and I saw hundreds, was riddled with snake bites. I doubt there'd be a coyote or wolf around if snakes killed them as easily as they kill us. Probably true for dogs, too. Long about mid-afternoon, Brother Charles and me left with Brother Bede to see the snake den. The day had warmed up enough. Brother Charles figured the snakes would be out sunning themselves. I haven't told you about Brother Bede. He often went with us on walks. I liked him. He was from Sonora. After his ma died of cholera during the Apache War, him and his pa and his brother headed for California. He was 6. Apaches attacked the wagon train on the Jorando del Muerto. His pa was killed. The brothers got split up among different families. He ended up in Magdalena, living on a farm with a penitente hermano and his family. He joined the Brotherhood when he was 15. A year later, he left Magdalena, planned to walk to California. A couple of weeks out, he stopped at St. Anselm for the night. Now, St. Anselm is the monastery where Billy is staying now. Stayed a week, then stayed for good. He became a monk, but he remained a penitente. Him and Brother Charles were amigos. I think Brother Charles knows his family. He mentions them in his diary. Before leaving, we put up Monhel and Scout. We followed a trail downstream along the Chama a couple of miles and turned back east up a side canyon. A couple of weeks ago, we'd have seen tarantulas on the run, on the march, Brother Charles said. They come down this canyon every year. I've seen them on the move in Texas, I said. Often wondered where they were headed. The males are the travelers, Brother Charles said. Females stay put and wait for males to show up. The ladies eat their lovers after mating is over. I'm glad they ain't marching now, Brother Bede said. I'd rather step on a rattlesnake. They aren't poisonous, Brother Charles said. The bite's like a bee sting. They are big and ugly, Brother Bede said. That's enough for me. 10 minutes later, we came to a gravelly outcrop. A dozen feet below were hundreds of rattlers, tangled together like piles of rope alive and smelling of burnt sugar. The dens are under the rocks, Brother Charles said. The snakes come out on warm afternoons. Soon they'll den up for the winter. When spring arrives, they'll head home. Brother Bede kicked a stone. It clattered down the rock and dropped among the snakes. Some scattered into burrows, some into the grass. The dry rattling hum of their tails grew louder and louder. Devils in the pit, Brother Bede said. I see why Satan in the garden was a snake. Forget what I said about rattlesnakes. I'm not getting close to those vipers. You reckon Satan was a viper, I said. Can we go now, Brother Bede said. About then, a tarantula crawled up over the edge of the ledge. Look here, Brother Charles said. You've stirred up a late lover, Brother Bede. Where? Brother Bede spun around to face the spider. He slipped on the gravel as he turned, falling backward over the edge. His screaming stopped when he hit the ground. Dozens of rattlers struck as they slithered over him. His arms disappeared, then his chest. His face and legs, still jerking, floated above a sea of writhing bodies. Terror fixed in his eyes. Then he sank beneath the swell. Oh God, Brother Charles cried as he started to climb down the rocks. I grabbed him and pulled him back. You can't help, I said. I can't leave him. You ain't got a choice. He tried to pull away. You go down there, I'll have 2 bodies to bring home. He sat on the ledge and wept. While Brother Charles sat in silent prayer, I gathered branches and vines to make a travois. By late afternoon, the cold was settling in. When I looked over the ledge, the snakes were gone. Brother Bede lay on his back, his clothes torn, his face a morass of caked blood. We climbed down and laid him on the travois. His eyes were milking over. Brother Charles closed them. As we were leaving, I shot a couple of stragglers headed to the den. It was near dark when we got back to the monastery. Padre Romo met me at the cloister gate, his eyes tearing. I feared trouble when you missed vespers, he said. When the bell rang for vigils next morning, I was already awake, got dressed and went to the chapel. It was bitter cold. The moon had set. The sun wouldn't be up for a couple of hours. Stars lit up the canyon. Coyotes yapped at one another across the way. Most of the monks were in their stalls. I took a bench in the back and listened as the monks chanted the psalms. Brother Bede was dressed in his monk's robes, lying on a cooling board before the altar. He was unrecognizable. Before Mass, Padre Romo talked about Brother Bede, who he was, where he came from. That's when I learned most of what I told you about him. After Mass, the monks carried him on a rise, carried him to a rise overlooking the Chama and laid him in the ground. Raoul had dug the grave during the night. The sky was beginning to lighten. Stars were fading. Magpies were jabbering down by the river. Padre Romuald said a few prayers. The monks chanted psalms again. When they finished, each of them dropped a shovelful of dirt into the grave. Padre stuck a cross of fir into the ground next to Brother Bede's head. Then the monks walked in twos back to the cloister, chanting. Raoul filled in the grave. I offered to help, but he said it was best if he did it alone.
Ooh, I like that. Lots of intrigue there. Okay,
Yep.
we've got some questions coming in from the audience.
Okay.
Don Dacanella would like to know some things about your writing and reading process. Says, I'm sure you read lots of history while writing your novel, but did you read any other works of fiction about Billy during or after the writing of your book?
Yes, I did. There are several novels about Billy. In fact, sorry, folks, I'm 77 years old. Names are getting away from me. Yeah, a novelist that you all know who wrote Lonesome Dove.
Larry Mcmurtry.
Thank you very much. Larry Mcmurtry even wrote a book called Anything for Billy. I read it. It's supposed to be about Billy the Kid. The protagonist in it is named Billy. I had a hard time figuring out how he was Billy the Kid, but hey, that's Larry McMurtry's right to do whatever he wants to with. I suspect some people will, reading this novel, will say, how does this deal with Billy the Kid? But the first part covers the Lincoln County War, so that should be enough. Yeah, I read fiction about Billy, and then there are a number of novels that have been written about him. I read a lot of history about him. I still read history about him. I read a book about Billy the Kid that came out back in July, I think. I just discovered it a couple of weeks ago. It was written by a professor at the University of New Mexico. And it's a history, and it's a history about Billy the Kid, but and it's also brings him up to date and how he has been viewed in literature and movies and so on. Interesting book. But yeah, no, I read a lot of memoirs, and that's where a lot of stories come from. All the stories that I tell in this, and this book is full of little stories like this one that I just read. And they all have a point. They all lead to the conclusions of the book in one manner or another. One reviewer referred to them as parables, which I really liked. I hadn't thought of them as being parables, but he was picking on the gospel title, and so he called them parables, and I thought that was pretty nice. But I get a lot of information out of these memoirs. I get stories out of the memoirs. My brother Cormac said one time that writers steal stuff, and I took that at its, if he says I can steal, then I can steal. When you steal, you can't steal it directly. You certainly can't plagiarize it, but you can take the ideas or the stories and you can make something else. You can make your own story out of them. And so I've done that a lot in the book. And I frankly, I have to say, I have been a writer all my life. Every job I ever had, including when I was working for the Park Service, I was a writer. But I never considered writing fiction at all. And certainly never thought about it when I retired until my friend goaded me into it. But I have found the writing process an enormous amount of fun. And I think anybody who retires, you need something to keep your mind active, keep your brain alive, and drive out the Alzheimer's, and keep you happy and sane. And I found the writing to be an absolutely extraordinary process, and I've loved every minute of it. And I've loved being retired as a result.